Montana Territory, 1875. The winter winds howled across the plains like vengeful spirits, but inside the warm glow of Clearwater's only dance hall, another storm was brewing. 25-year-old Ross Fletcher stood with his back against the rough-hewn wall, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floorboards. His hazel eyes, sharp as a hawk's, surveyed the room with the watchfulness that 3 years on the open range had instilled in him. Though his face was handsome, high cheekbones, strong jaw dusted with light stubble, there was a hardness to his expression that kept most folks at a respectful distance. "Another whiskey," the bartender's voice barely carried over the fiddle music. Ross shook his head. "One's enough." He'd learned long ago that dulling his senses was a luxury a cowboy couldn't afford, not when danger lurked around every corner of this untamed land. The winter social had drawn nearly every soul from 50 miles around, ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, and their families, all seeking respite from the isolation that defined frontier life. Women in their Sunday best twirled across the floor, their colorful skirts blooming like wildflowers against the drab backdrop of a Montana winter, but Ross had no interest in dancing. He'd buried his heart 3 years ago alongside his parents after a Blackfoot raid on their homestead. That day had taught him the most important lesson of the frontier: attachment was weakness, love was a liability. The only way to survive was alone, focused solely on the next day's work, the next season's drive, the next dollar earned. Anything else was just asking for the kind of pain no man could endure twice. Fletcher. "Get over here and be sociable for once." Sam Hollies, owner of the Circle H ranch where Ross worked as a trail boss, waved him over. Sam stood with his wife and daughter, surrounded by a cluster of young women who had been imported from back east by hopeful parents seeking to marry their daughters to land and prosperity. Ross reluctantly pushed off the wall. Refusing Sam would be disrespectful, and if there was one thing Ross still believed in, it was honoring the man who had given him work when grief had nearly consumed him. "Ladies, this here's Ross Fletcher, best horseman and trail boss this side of the Missouri," Sam announced, slapping Ross on the back. "Single too," he added with a wink that made the women titter behind gloved hands. The introductions blurred together, names and faces Ross had no intention of remembering. His plan was simple: be polite, exchange pleasantries, then retreat to the bunkhouse where he belonged. But as he was about to excuse himself, the crowd parted momentarily, revealing a young woman sitting alone in the corner. She wore a simple blue dress, modest compared to the elaborate frills and bustles that adorned the other women. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though a few wayward curls had escaped to frame a face that was striking in its uniqueness. Not conventionally beautiful by Eastern standards, her nose was slightly too prominent, her chin too determined, her freckles too abundant across sun-kissed skin. But there was something in the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified despite being obviously excluded, that caught Ross's attention. "Who's that?" he found himself asking, interrupting whatever Sam's daughter had been saying. Sam squinted. "Oh, that's Lucille Garrett, Laura Garrett's younger sister. Arrived from Pennsylvania about 3 months back. Bit plain, that one, not like her sister who married up to the banker's son right quick. Folks call her Library Lucy," one of the women added with poorly disguised disdain. "Always got her nose stuck in a book instead of learning proper household ways. 20 years old and not a single suitor to speak of." Ross felt an unexpected flare of irritation at their dismissive tone. He knew what it was to be an outsider, to be judged and found wanting by those who knew nothing of your true worth. "Excuse me," he said, ignoring the surprised looks as he walked away. As he approached, Lucille Garrett looked up from the small notebook she'd been writing in. Her eyes, a startling deep blue against her brown hair, widened slightly before narrowing with suspicion. "Miss Garrett," Ross said, tipping his hat. "Ross Fletcher, I work for the Circle H." "Mr. Fletcher," she acknowledged with a nod that was neither welcoming nor dismissive. "Have you been sent to fulfill some charitable duty by dancing with the wallflower?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, and something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Respect, perhaps. "No, ma'am, just thought you might like some company that doesn't require dancing." A perceptive observation, a hint of a smile, touched her lips. "I find these gatherings tedious, but my sister insisted I come." Something about integrating into society and finding prospects. She said the words with such obvious disdain that Ross nearly smiled. Not fond of prospects. Not fond of being a prospect, Mr. Fletcher. Like cattle at auction, her gaze was steady, challenging. Ross found himself sitting down beside her. Most women around here are eager for marriage. Security's hard to come by on the frontier. Security is an illusion anywhere, Mr. Fletcher. Life has taught me that much. She closed her notebook. I came west to teach. The school board promised me a position, but apparently they expected someone more conventional. The word hung between them, loaded with all the unspoken judgments of a society that valued women primarily as wives and mothers. Their loss, Ross said simply. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence as the music played on. Ross found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the small scar near her left eyebrow that told of a life not always sheltered. She was nothing like the soft, helpless eastern flowers that wilted at the first sign of frontier hardship. They're all staring at us, Lucille commented without looking around. Let them. Makes no difference to me what folks think. A man can afford such luxury of thought, a woman cannot. Despite her words, there was no self-pity in her tone, only pragmatism. Before Ross could respond, a commotion erupted at the entrance. A group of rough-looking men had entered, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and wariness that Ross recognized from his own trail days. Cattle drive must have finished early, he murmured, instantly alert. End-of-drive celebrations often turned rowdy, especially when men who'd been on the trail for months encountered civilization and whiskey again. They look half frozen, Lucille observed. Ross nodded. December drive is brutal, most outfits avoid it unless they're desperate. The lead cowboy, a tall man with a face weathered beyond his years, approached the bar. Word is there's a doctor in town, his voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. Got a boy hurt bad about 3 miles back, horse spooked at a snake, rolled on him. The town doctor, old Dr. Simmons, stepped forward. How bad? Bad enough, legs broken clean through the skin, been bleeding something fierce. Lucille stood suddenly. I have nursing experience from the war. All eyes turned to her, including Ross's, filled with fresh surprise. You're a nurse, doctor? Simmons asked skeptically. I volunteered in a field hospital in Pennsylvania for 2 years. Her chin lifted. I've seen compound fractures before. I know how to assist. The doctor hesitated only briefly. Very well. I'll need all the help I can get. Ross found himself on his feet. I'll come too. Got a good horse outside that can break trail. The decision came without thought, instinctual, like avoiding a snake in tall grass. He told himself it was practical. They'd need strong hands to move an injured man. But something deeper, something he'd buried alongside his family, stirred restlessly in his chest as he watched Lucille Garrett gather her shawl, her movements efficient and purposeful. Within minutes, they were riding out into the darkness, Ross leading the way with Lucille seated behind Dr. Simmons on his old gelding. The snow had started again, fat flakes swirling in the lamplight as they left the warmth of town behind. You didn't have to come, Lucille said when they drew alongside each other on a stretch of open road. Neither did you, Ross replied, watching her profile in the dim light. Yet here we are. Her eyes, when they met his, held no artifice, no coyness, none of the practiced allure the other women had displayed. Just steady determination and something that looked remarkably like trust, a commodity rarer than gold in Ross Fletcher's experience. Yes, she said simply, here we are. And with those words, spoken in the bitter cold of a Montana winter night, something shifted in the carefully constructed fortress of Ross Fletcher's solitude, a hairline crack no wider than a whisper, but enough to let in the first breath of change. The injured cowboy, barely more than a boy, really, lay shivering under a makeshift tent of canvas. His face was ghostly white against the blood-soaked blanket covering his lower half, lips blue from cold and shock. 17 at most, Ross guessed, probably on his first cattle drive. Dr. Simmons knelt beside him, cutting away the boy's pants leg to reveal the gruesome injury. The white end of bone protruded through torn flesh, surrounded by dirt and fabric fragments. Name, the doctor asked, already reaching for his medical bag. Jamie, the boy gasped. Jamie Walsh. Well, Jamie, we're going to fix you up, but it's going to hurt like blazes first. The doctor looked up at the trail boss. Need 2 men to hold him down. Ross moved forward alongside another cowhand. As they positioned themselves, he found himself opposite Lucille, who had already shed her shawl and was rolling up her sleeves. "Miss Garrett, I'll need you to clean the wound while I prepare the chloroform," Dr. Simmons instructed. Without hesitation, she knelt in the bloodied snow and began methodically cleaning around the protruding bone, her movements gentle but efficient. The boy whimpered but didn't thrash. Shock, Ross knew, was keeping the worst of the pain at bay for now. "Easy, son," he murmured, gripping the boy's shoulders firmly. "You're in good hands." Lucille worked steadily, her face a mask of concentration, as she followed the doctor's instructions. When it came time to set the bone, she held the leg steady without flinching, even as the boy's scream tore through the night despite the chloroform. It took over an hour to clean, set, and splint the break. Throughout it all, Lucille remained calm, her hands never wavering even as blood soaked her sleeves and spattered her blue dress. When the worst was done, she wiped the boy's forehead with a cool cloth, speaking softly to him as the doctor prepared a morphine injection. "You did well, Jamie," she told him. "Very brave." The boy's eyes, glazed with pain and drugs, focused on her face. "Are you an angel, ma'am?" A smile touched her lips, genuine, unguarded, transforming her face in a way that made Ross's chest tighten unexpectedly. "No, just a woman who knows a thing or two about broken bones." Only when the boy had fallen into a morphine sleep did she sit back on her heels, the weariness finally showing in the slump of her shoulders. Ross offered her his canteen wordlessly, and she accepted with a nod of thanks. "We need to get him to town," Dr. Simmons announced, packing his supplies. "The leg needs proper care, and he's at risk of fever out here." "My men can fashion a travois," the trail boss offered. "Slow going in this snow, though." "I know a shortcut," Ross found himself saying, "through Coleman's property. Cuts off about a mile." "Coleman doesn't allow trespassers," the trail boss warned. "He will for this." Ross's tone brooked no argument. Old man Coleman owed him a favor after Ross had helped round up his scattered herd during last spring's flash flood. They worked quickly to construct a travois, lashing poles to a steady horse and creating a bed of blankets. When it came time to move the boy, Lucille directed them with quiet authority on how to support the injured leg, demonstrating a knowledge that went well beyond basic nursing. "Where did you really learn all this?" Ross asked quietly as they prepared to depart. She glanced at him, something guarded flickering in her eyes. "I told you, the war." Most volunteer nurses weren't doing bone setting and directing surgeons. Her hands stilled on the blanket she was tucking around the boy. "My father was a doctor. I assisted him from the time I was 12. A pause. "He died at Gettysburg. I continued his work as best I could." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Ross with unexpected force. He recognized the particular brand of grief she carried, the kind that shapes you into something different than you might have been. "I lost my family too," he found himself saying, 3 years ago. Indian raid. She met his eyes, and in that moment something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding deeper than words. She didn't offer platitudes or pity, just a slight nod of acknowledgement that somehow meant more than any consoling words could have. The journey back to town was slow and difficult. Ross led the way, breaking trail through fresh snow that had already covered their outgoing tracks. Lucille walked beside the travois, checking on Jamie regularly, adjusting his position when necessary. The temperature continued to drop, and Ross noticed her shivering despite her attempts to hide it. Without a word, he removed his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. She started to protest, but he cut her off. "I'm used to the cold," he said simply. "And I'm used to not accepting charity," she countered, but made no move to remove the coat. "It's not charity, it's practical. Can't have you freezing before we get the boy to town." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Always practical, Mr. Fletcher." "Ross," he corrected, "and yes. Sentiment gets people killed out here." "Does it?" She glanced down at Jamie, unconscious on the travois. "Or does it sometimes save them?" He had no answer for that. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Clearwater. The town was stirring, smoke rising from chimneys as they made their way to Dr. Simmons' small clinic behind the general store. Jamie was carefully transferred to a proper bed, his color improved enough that the doctor pronounced him likely to keep both his life and his leg. "You've got a gift, Miss Garrett," Dr. Simmons said as they washed up afterward. "Steadiest hands I've seen in years. Shame the school board can't recognize talent when they see it." Lucille's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. "Thank you, doctor. I'm glad I could help." "I could use an assistant," the older man continued, rubbing his arthritic hands. "These winters make my joints less reliable than I'd like." "Would you consider the position?" The shock on her face was quickly replaced by determination. "I would, doctor, very much." Ross, standing by the door, felt an unexpected surge of something, pride, relief. He couldn't name it, only knew that the thought of Lucille Garrett finding her place in Clearwater settled something restless inside him. "I should get back to the ranch," he said, suddenly aware he'd lingered longer than necessary. "Sam will be wondering where I disappeared to." Lucille turned, seeming to remember his presence. "Your coat," she began, moving to remove it. "Keep it for now," he said. "I'll collect it another time." Their eyes met, and again that strange current passed between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. "Thank you," she said finally, "for your help tonight." He nodded once, unable to find words for what he wanted to say, then turned and walked out into the cold morning light, feeling strangely unsettled, as if something fundamental had shifted while he wasn't looking. News traveled fast in small towns. By noon, everyone in Clearwater knew about the midnight rescue and Lucille Garrett's unexpected medical prowess. Ross heard the whispers when he rode into town 3 days later to collect supplies for the ranch. "Library Lucy saved that boy's life," they say. Dr. Simmons took her on as his assistant. Never would have thought a woman like that. The undercurrent of surprise in their tones irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. As if a woman who didn't fit their narrow definition of beauty couldn't possibly possess other qualities worth valuing. He found himself outside the doctor's office before he'd consciously decided to go there. Through the window, he could see Lucille organizing supplies, her movements precise and efficient. She tied her hair back with a simple ribbon and wore a practical dark skirt and white blouse instead of the blue dress he remembered. He was about to turn away when she looked up and saw him. Something flickered across her face, surprise, pleasure, uncertainty, before she composed herself and came to the door. "Mr. Fletcher," she greeted him. "Come to reclaim your coat." "Ross," he reminded her, "and yes, if it's convenient." Of course, she held the door open, inviting him inside. "I've washed it." The blood came out completely. The small waiting room was empty, the doctor apparently out on a call. Ross stood awkwardly, hat in hand, suddenly unsure why he'd really come. "How is the boy?" he asked as she retrieved his coat from a back room. "Jamie, recovering well, no fever, which is fortunate. He'll limp, but he'll keep the leg." She handed him the coat, neatly folded. "Doctor Simmons says he has you to thank as well. The shortcut saved precious time." Ross shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said simply, "they wouldn't have." Their fingers brushed as he took the coat, and he noticed her hands, elegant despite being chapped from frequent washing, a small burned scar across one knuckle. "Working hands, capable hands. I hear you got the position with the doctor," he said. She nodded, a genuine smile lighting her face. "Yes, it seems my questionable social graces are overlooked in favor of medical knowledge. A fair trade, I think. The school board's loss. Perhaps, though I find I prefer setting bones to teaching letters." She paused, studying him with those direct blue eyes. "And you, Ross Fletcher?" "Back to the solitary life of a cowboy." Something in her tone challenged him, as if she saw through the careful walls he'd built around himself. "It's what I know," he answered. "Is it what you want?" The question caught him off guard. Want? He'd stopped thinking in terms of wants 3 years ago, focused only on needs, on survival. "What I want doesn't much matter out here," he said finally. "I disagree." Her gaze was steady. "I think it's all that matters in the end." Before he could formulate a response, the door opened, and Dr. Simmons bustled in, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the smell of pipe tobacco. "Fletcher, heard you were part of our midnight adventure. Good work, son." The old doctor clapped him on the shoulder. "Miss Garrett has been indispensable since. Don't know how I managed without her." Lucille's cheeks colored slightly at the praise, but her posture remained straight, proud. Just doing what needed doing, Ross said, suddenly eager to leave. The small room felt confining, and Lucille's presence, her direct gaze, her unflinching questions, unsettled him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. "Thank you for the coat, Miss Garrett." He nodded to them both and stepped outside, breathing deeply of the cold air. As he mounted his horse, he glanced back to find her watching him from the doorway, a thoughtful expression on her face that followed him all the way back to the Circle H. Winter deepened its grip on the Montana territory. January brought bitter cold and howling blizzards that kept most people close to home, venturing out only when necessary. Ross threw himself into ranch work, taking the most difficult assignments, volunteering for the longest watches. Exhaustion, he found, was preferable to the strange restlessness that plagued him during quiet moments. Sam noticed, of course. The old rancher had keen eyes and keener intuition. "You're working yourself to death, boy," he commented one evening as Ross mended tack by lamplight after the other hands had turned in. "Something eating at you." Ross shrugged, "Just earning my keep." Sam studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. "Heard you helped save that Walsh boy with the Garrett girl." Ross's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "Doctor did the saving, we just helped." "Not what I heard." Sam settled into a chair. "Heard she handled herself like a battlefield surgeon, and that you gave her your coat for the walk back." "It was cold," Ross said flatly. "Must have been for you to notice someone besides yourself." The words were blunt but delivered without malice, just Sam's typical straight-talking manner. "You've been keeping folks at arm's length since you came here, Fletcher. It's natural enough after what happened to your family, but a man can't live on work and grief alone." Ross set the bridle aside, irritation flaring. "I'm not looking for advice on living, Sam." "No? Then why do you look like you've lost something every time you ride back from town?" Sam's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Seen that look before. Usually means a woman's involved." "You're imagining things." Ross stood abruptly. "I'm turning in." Sam's chuckle followed him to the door. "Deny it all you want, boy, but I've been around long enough to know when a man's heart is waking up whether he wants it to or not." Ross lay awake in his bunk that night, Sam's words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. Was that what this was, his heart waking up? The very idea was absurd. He'd buried his capacity for that kind of feeling alongside his parents. He'd seen what love cost on the frontier, the terrible vulnerability it created, the devastating loss when it was ripped away. And yet, Lucille Garrett's face appeared unbidden in his thoughts. Not conventionally beautiful, the townsfolk said, plain, bookish, too independent for a proper woman. But when he closed his eyes, he saw the steadiness of her hands as she tended Jamie's wound, the intelligence in her gaze when she challenged his assumptions, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite the town's dismissal. He remembered his mother once saying that true beauty revealed itself in action, not appearance. By that measure, Lucille Garrett might be the most beautiful woman he'd ever encountered. The realization disturbed him deeply. February brought a brief thaw, enough to make travel possible, but treacherous with sudden meltwater and unpredictable ice. Ross found himself volunteering to make the supply run to town, ignoring Sam's knowing look as he saddled his horse. Clearwater was unusually busy. A stagecoach had managed to get through from Helena, bringing mail and passengers eager to stretch their legs. Ross secured the ranch supplies efficiently, then hesitated outside the general store, his business concluded but his feet reluctant to turn homeward. "Mr. Fletcher," a familiar voice broke into his thoughts. He turned to see Lucille approaching, a medical bag in hand. She wore a practical dark green dress under a heavy woolen coat, her cheeks flushed from cold or exertion. "Miss Garrett," he tipped his hat, aware of a strange lightening in his chest at the sight of her. "Doctor keeping you busy?" "Very. The thaw always brings injuries, people getting careless after being cooped up too long." She adjusted her grip on the bag. "I've just come from the Miller farm. Their youngest broke his arm trying to climb the barn roof." "Need help with that?" he asked, nodding to the heavy-looking bag. She hesitated only briefly before handing it to him. "Thank you." "It's got heavier since Dr. Simmons added new surgical tools." They fell into step together, an easy rhythm that belied their brief acquaintance. Ross was acutely aware of the curious glances they attracted, the solitary cowboy and the unconventional doctor's assistant walking side by side down Clearwater's main street. "You're causing quite a stir," he commented, nodding slightly toward an older woman who had stopped sweeping her porch to stare openly. Lucille's mouth quirked in a wry smile. "I'm accustomed to it. Though usually I'm being stared at alone, not as part of a scandalous pair." "Is that what we are, scandalous? In a town this size, two unmarried people walking together is practically an engagement announcement." Her tone was light, but he detected an undercurrent of something, frustration perhaps, at the confines of small-town propriety. "Does that bother you, what people think?" She considered the question seriously as they walked, less than it once did. "I've learned that people will talk regardless of what you do. Better to give them something worth talking about." Ross found himself chuckling, a rusty sound he barely recognized. "Is that why you chose medicine over more conventional pursuits?" "I didn't choose medicine," she corrected. "It chose me. My father needed help, then the war came then." She shrugged. "One day I realized it had become part of who I am, not something I do." They reached the doctor's office, and Ross handed back her bag, oddly reluctant for their conversation to end. "Would you," he began, then stopped, uncertain what he was even asking. She waited, her head tilted slightly, eyes curious. "Would you have dinner with me?" The words emerged before he could reconsider them. "Tonight. At the hotel restaurant." Surprise flashed across her face, followed quickly by something warmer. "Are you certain you want to give the gossips that much fuel, Mr. Fletcher?" "Ross," he reminded her, "and yes. I find I don't much care what people think." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his true intentions. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "7 o'clock," she said. "And I should warn you, I'm not much for conventional dinner conversation either." He felt his lips curve in a genuine smile. "I'm counting on it, Miss Garrett." "Lucille," she corrected, returning his smile with one of her own before disappearing into the doctor's office. Ross stood there longer than necessary, aware that he'd just taken a step toward something he'd sworn to avoid: connection, vulnerability, the dangerous territory of caring for someone other than himself. Yet for the first time in 3 years, the prospect filled him not with dread but with a strange, forgotten sensation that might almost be anticipation. The hotel restaurant was Clearwater's closest approximation of fine dining: white tablecloths, actual glass windows, and a cook who had once worked in a Chicago hotel. Ross arrived early, uncomfortable in his best shirt and the string tie he kept for funerals and Christmas service. He'd shaved carefully and slicked back his hair with pomade borrowed from one of the ranch hands. He felt conspicuous and out of place, acutely aware of the sidelong glances from the other diners, mostly traveling businessmen and a few of the town's more prosperous families. A cowboy dining alone at the hotel was unusual enough. A cowboy obviously waiting for someone was cause for speculation. When Lucille entered, the quiet murmur of conversation faltered momentarily. She wore the same blue dress from the dance, but had added a simple cameo at her throat and arranged her brown hair in a softer style that framed her face. Not elaborate by Eastern standards, but a clear effort had been made. Ross rose as she approached, struck again by how his perception of her differed so markedly from the town's dismissive assessment. Yes, her features were strong rather than delicate, her figure practical rather than fashionably fragile, but there was a quiet confidence in her bearing, an intelligence in her eyes that drew his gaze far more powerfully than conventional beauty ever could. "You look," he began, searching for the right word. "Presentable," she suggested with a hint of self-deprecation. "Beautiful," he finished firmly. A flush spread across her cheeks, and for a moment she looked genuinely flustered, a contrast to her usual composure that he found unexpectedly charming. "Thank you," she said simply, taking the seat he held for her. "You clean up rather well yourself, Cowboy." The meal progressed with surprising ease. Lucille, true to her warning, didn't limit herself to the safe topics considered appropriate for ladies: the weather, household matters, gentle gossip. Instead, she spoke passionately about medical advancements she'd read about, asked insightful questions about cattle ranching, and shared stories of her father's practice in Pennsylvania that revealed both her knowledge and her compassion. Ross found himself talking more than he had in years, describing the beauty of the high country in spring, the satisfaction of working with horses who responded to the subtlest guidance, even his hopes of saving enough to claim his own small spread someday. Not the Circle H? She asked, genuine interest in her expression. He shook his head. Sam's been good to me, but a man needs his own place eventually, something he's built with his own hands. I understand that feeling. She traced the rim of her water glass thoughtfully. It's why I came west, to build something of my own, away from people who only saw me as poor Dr. Garrett's odd daughter. Is that how they saw you? Among other things, her smile turned wry, too studious, too plain, too outspoken. My mother died when I was young, so there was no one to teach me proper feminine arts, just my father, who treated me as an apprentice rather than a decoration. He sounds like a wise man. He was, her eyes softened with memory. He believed women's minds were just as capable as men's, given proper education, a radical notion, especially in our small town. And now, do you miss Pennsylvania? She considered the question seriously. I miss what was familiar. But Pennsylvania held nothing for me after father died. My sister married, my brother went west to California. I was superfluous. The word hung between them, loaded with quiet pain that Ross recognized all too well, the ache of being unneeded, unanchored. You're not superfluous here, he said quietly. Ask Jamie Walsh or Dr. Simmons. Her eyes, when they met his, held a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Or you. The question landed like a physical touch, startling in its directness. Ross found himself at a crossroads, retreat behind the walls he'd built so carefully, or step into unknown territory with this remarkable woman who seemed to see through them anyway. Or me, he acknowledged, his voice low. Something shifted in her expression, relief, perhaps, or a tentative hope that matched the unfamiliar feeling expanding in his own chest. The restaurant had nearly emptied around them, the hour grown late without either noticing. When they finally stepped outside, the night air was crisp with the promise of returning frost, stars scattered like diamond dust across the clear sky. May I walk you home? He asked. She nodded, and they set off toward the small rooms she rented above the milliner's shop. Their hands brushed once, twice, until Ross took a chance and captured hers in his. Her fingers curled around his without hesitation, warm despite the cold night. Neither spoke, but the silence between them hummed with unspoken possibility, frightening in its intensity, yet somehow right in a way Ross couldn't explain even to himself. At her door she turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. People will talk, you know, about tonight, about us. Let them, he said simply, it won't be kind talk. The odd, plain doctor's assistant and the solitary cowboy. He reached up, surprising himself, to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. I don't see either of those people when I look at us. What do you see? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Two people who understand loss, and maybe possibility. Her eyes searched his, looking for hesitation or falsehood. Finding neither, she smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face in the moonlight. Possibility, she repeated softly. I like that word. When he leaned down to kiss her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, gentle at first, a question rather than a demand, then deepening as she responded with unexpected warmth. Her hands came up to rest lightly on his chest, and he could feel her heart racing to match his own. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, momentarily overwhelmed by the tide of emotion that had breached his carefully constructed defenses. Good night, Lucille, he murmured. Good night, Ross. She touched his cheek once, gently, then slipped inside, leaving him standing in the moonlight with the sensation that something fundamental had irreversibly changed. Spring came early to Montana that year, a gentle awakening rather than the usual violent transition from winter to summer. As the snow retreated and the first green touched the valleys, Ross found himself drawn to town with increasing frequency. What began as dinner once a week soon became regular rides together on Lucille's afternoons off, conversations that stretched long into evening, and a deepening connection that neither had anticipated but both increasingly relied upon. The town's initial gossip, curious, sometimes unkind, gradually shifted to acceptance as they became a familiar pair. Ross's taciturn reputation softened somewhat, while Lucille's position as the doctor's respected assistant lent her a professional standing that partly offset her unconventional nature. Still, Ross was acutely aware that their relationship existed in a kind of limbo, more than friendship, but undefined in ways that occasionally brought shadows to Lucille's eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He knew what she wanted, what any woman would want, but the final step toward true commitment remained beyond his reach, blocked by the fortress of fear he'd built around his heart. It was Sam who finally confronted him, on a warm May afternoon as they mended fence together on the far pasture. "When are you going to marry that girl?" the older man asked bluntly, driving a post into the soft earth with practiced strength. Ross nearly missed the nail he was hammering. "What makes you think?" "Don't insult my intelligence, boy," Sam straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "You've been mooning over her for months. Half your pay goes to that hotel restaurant. You keep your good shirt pressed now," he snorted. "Doesn't take a genius to see which way the wind's blowing." Ross focused on securing the wire to the post, uncomfortable with the direct question. "It's complicated." "No, it's not. You're scared." Sam's voice softened slightly. "After what happened to your folks, that's natural enough. But let me ask you something. If you'd known what was coming, would you have wanted them to never have each other, never have you?" The question hit Ross like a physical blow. "That's different." "Is it? Every day on this frontier is borrowed time, always has been. Indians, weather, disease, accidents, 100 ways to die out here." Sam handed him another nail. "But that's why the loving matters more, not less." Ross drove the nail with more force than necessary. "And if I lose her too?" "Then you'll hurt like hell, same as you did before." "Same as I did when I lost my Martha." Sam's weathered face creased with old grief. "But I'll tell you this, 15 years with her was worth every second of pain that came after. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They worked in silence for several minutes, the rhythmic sound of hammering punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle. "She deserves better than half a man," Ross said finally, voicing the fear that had haunted him. "Someone who can give her all of himself, not just the parts that aren't scarred over." Sam laughed, a genuine, full-bodied sound. "Son, there isn't a man alive out here who isn't scarred over in some way. That's the West. We all carry marks." He clapped Ross on the shoulder. "The question is whether you're brave enough to show her yours and trust she'll stay anyway." The words stayed with Ross that evening as he rode back to the bunkhouse and through the restless night that followed. By morning, he'd made his decision, terrifying as it was. He rode into town that afternoon, not on his usual day, and found Lucille at the doctor's office grinding herbs for medicines. Her face lit with surprise and pleasure when she saw him. "Ross, I wasn't expecting you until Saturday." "I know," he shifted nervously, aware of Dr. Simmons pretending not to listen from his desk. "Are you free to ride out with me? There's something I want to show you." Curiosity crossed her face. "Let me ask the doctor." "Go on, girl," Dr. Simmons interrupted, not bothering to maintain the pretense of disinterest. "Everything here can wait." 20 minutes later, they were riding east of town, Lucille on a gentle mare she'd learned to handle with increasing confidence over the past months. Ross led them along a creek that wound through rolling hills until they reached a small valley, sheltered by cottonwoods with a clear view of the mountains to the west. "It's beautiful," Lucille commented as they dismounted. "I haven't been this way before." Ross tied the horses, his heart pounding uncomfortably against his ribs. "This land came available last week. The Wilsons are moving back east, health problems." She looked around with fresh interest. "It's good land, sheltered with water." 160 acres. Ross walked to where a small cabin stood, weather-beaten but solid, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. "The cabin needs work, new roof, bigger windows. But the foundation's sound." Lucille studied him, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more intense. "Ross, did you buy this place?" He nodded, unable to find the right words for what he needed to say. "Your own spread," she said softly, understanding dawning, "what you've been working toward." "Yes," he took her hand, drawing her toward the cabin's porch. "But it's not enough just having the land. A place like this needs life, a future." Her eyes widened slightly, hope and uncertainty warring in their blue depths. "What are you saying?" Ross took a deep breath, finally letting the walls around his heart crumble completely. "I'm saying I love you, Lucille. I have almost from the beginning, though I fought against it with everything I had. I told myself I couldn't risk caring that much again, that loving someone on this frontier was just asking for heartbreak." Her fingers tightened around his, but she remained silent, letting him find his way through words that didn't come easily. Sam told me something yesterday, that the possibility of loss is what makes love matter more out here, not less, and he's right. Ross looked out over the land, his land, then back to her face. I can't promise we won't face hardship. Or that we'll have 50 years together. Nobody on this frontier can promise that, but I can promise to love you completely for whatever time we're given. Tears had gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her characteristic strength evident even now. Is this a proposal, Ross Fletcher? He smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years despite the gravity of the moment. It is, a proper one. He knelt on one knee, still holding her hand. Lucille Garrett, will you marry me? Make this place a home with me. Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. Her free hand came up to touch his face, tracing the contours as if memorizing them. People said I was plain, odd. That no man would want me. People are fools, he said firmly. I see you, Lucille, your strength, your intelligence, your compassion, your beauty, which has nothing to do with what those small minds think beauty should be, and everything to do with who you truly are. A tear escaped, trailing down her cheek as she smiled, a radiant expression that confirmed everything he'd just said about her beauty. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Ross Fletcher, I will marry you. He rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion he'd held back for so long, the fear finally overwhelmed by the promise of joy, of a shared life, of the home they would build together. When they finally parted, she laughed softly, a sound of pure happiness that echoed across the land that would be theirs. What will people say, the solitary cowboy and the odd doctor's assistant? They'll say we saw what they couldn't, he answered, drawing her close again. The possibility of something extraordinary right in front of them all along. Lucille and Ross were married on a perfect June day beneath the cottonwoods on their new property. The ceremony was simple but well attended. Dr. Simmons, Sam and his family, the hands from the Circle H, and even a few townsfolk who had gradually warmed to the unconventional couple. Lucille wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Ross stood tall in a new suit, the nervousness in his eyes giving way to absolute certainty when he saw her approaching on Sam's arm. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with a depth of feeling that moved even the most stoic ranchers present. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up scattered birds from the nearby trees. The celebration lasted well into evening, with tables set up under the trees, food contributed by neighboring ranches, and music provided by a fiddle player from the saloon who had a surprising repertoire of decent songs. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Ross found a moment of quiet with his new wife as the dancing continued, drawing her away to the porch of what was now their home. Happy Mrs. Fletcher, he asked, his arm around her waist. Completely, Mr. Fletcher, she leaned into him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder, though I think Dr. Simmons is already planning how to lure me back to work once we're settled. Ross chuckled. I assumed as much. I wouldn't expect you to give up medicine, it's part of who you are. She looked up at him, gratitude and love clear in her expression. Most husbands wouldn't understand that. I'm not most husbands, he reminded her, and you're certainly not most wives. Thank goodness for that, her smile turned mischievous, though I did promise Mrs. Wilson I'd preserve her rose bushes, so perhaps I'm not entirely without conventional feminine aspirations. Roses and surgical instruments, a unique combination. Like a cowboy who quotes poetry when he thinks no one is listening, she countered, referring to her discovery of his small collection of dog-eared books. He laughed, pulling her closer. We're quite the pair, aren't we? We are, she grew serious, her hands coming up to frame his face. And I promise you, Ross Fletcher, that whatever comes, good or difficult, we'll face it together. He kissed her then, sealing that promise as the stars emerged above and their future stretched before them, uncertain in its details but absolutely secure in its foundation. The years that followed brought both joy and hardship, as years on the frontier inevitably did. Their ranch flourished under Ross's careful management, expanding gradually as they acquired adjacent parcels. The cabin grew too, first with a proper kitchen and larger bedroom, then with a small medical office where Lucille could see patients when weather made the trip to town impossible. Children came, first a son with Ross's quiet strength and Lucille's questioning mind, then twin daughters who combined their father's horsemanship with their mother's determination. The house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with bedrooms upstairs and books filling every available shelf. Lucille continued her medical work, eventually taking over fully when Dr. Simmons's eyesight failed. Ross supported her unfailingly, adjusting his schedule to parent alone when emergencies called her away, taking pride in her growing reputation as one of the territory's most respected medical practitioners. The town that had once whispered about Library Lucy and her unlikely marriage now pointed to the Fletcher family as an example of frontier success, their ranch prosperous, their children well-educated, their partnership a model of mutual respect that influenced younger couples. There were difficult times too, a fire that destroyed the barn one summer, a harsh winter that threatened their cattle, Ross's broken leg after a fall that left Lucille as both doctor and ranch manager for 2 long months. But they weathered each challenge together, the foundation of their love only strengthening with each test. On their 20th anniversary, they sat together on the porch of their now substantial home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Their children were inside, cleaning up after the celebration dinner, their son now a tall young man preparing for college back east, their daughters competently managing both household and horses with the confidence their parents had instilled. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lucille asked, her hand warm in his. The years had added silver to her brown hair and lines around her eyes, but to Ross, she remained as beautiful as she had been that night at the dance hall when he'd first truly seen her. "Never," he admitted, bringing her hand to his lips. "I couldn't have imagined being this happy, this complete." She smiled, leaning against him as they had countless times over the years. "Remember what Sam said about the loving mattering more because of the uncertainty." Ross nodded, thinking of their old friend who had passed 5 years earlier, content and surrounded by those who loved him. He was right. Every day has mattered more because we chose not to waste it in fear. "The cowboy and the ugly girl everyone ignored," Lucille mused, a hint of mischief in her voice. Who would have thought? Ross turned to face her fully, his hands framing the face he knew better than his own, every line, every freckle, every expression precious to him. "You were never ugly, Lucille Fletcher, just waiting to be seen by eyes that knew how to look properly. And you were never truly solitary," she countered softly. "Just waiting for someone who understood that silence isn't the same as emptiness." As the last light faded from the sky and their children's laughter drifted through the open windows, Ross Fletcher held his wife close, profoundly grateful for that winter night so many years ago when he'd broken his own rules and spoken to a woman sitting alone. Their lives had indeed been changed, not by grand adventures or dramatic revelations, but by the quiet miracle of 2 people recognizing in each other exactly what they needed most. In the distance, their horses grazed peacefully, their cattle dotted the hillsides, and the mountains stood sentinel over the home and family they had built together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, as all tomorrows did on the frontier. But tonight, in this moment, the love that had seemed so impossible, so dangerous to a grieving cowboy and a misunderstood woman had proven itself the surest foundation of all.